I stood in the center of the grand ballroom as the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. 300 pairs of eyes shifted toward me, while my own mother spoke into a microphone, calmly instructing security to remove me from the building. I did not scream or beg. I simply turned around, walked out the front doors, sat in my car, and legally seized their $18 million hotel empire before they even finished pouring the champagne. By midnight, they were pounding on my front door begging for mercy. My name is Diana, 33 years old, and a forensic accountant who spent 5 years secretly cleaning up my family's financial disasters. My daily life involves tracking corporate fraud, a skill set my family completely ignored. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to manipulative relatives who underestimated your quiet strength. Growing up in our wealthy Chicago suburb, I was always the scapegoat, preferring audit reports over country club gossip. Tonight was the grand reopening gala of our family boutique hotel. The chandeliers gleamed, casting warm light on the city elite. I arrived wearing a modest navy blue dress, feeling out of place among the custom tuxedos and designer gowns. The room was packed with influential guests, including the mayor and local journalists. Standing proudly by the ice sculpture was my mother, Beatrice. At 62 years old, she looked flawless in her emerald silk dress, her face a mask of socialite perfection. She lived for high society validation. Beside her stood my younger brother, Preston. He was 30 years old and the undeniable golden child. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and held a glass of bourbon, playing the successful chief executive officer. Leaning against him was his wife, Kendra. She was a brilliant and striking African-American woman, a high-end interior designer who knew exactly how to command a room. She caught my eye as I walked in, her expression unreadable and guarded. I had barely taken a sip of sparkling water when the sharp feedback of a microphone echoed through the ballroom. The music died instantly. Conversations halted. I looked up to see Beatrice standing on the main stage, staring directly at me. She cleared her throat, putting on her best sorrowful face. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate our family legacy. We are blessed to share this space with our community. However, as many of you know, our family is currently on a very difficult healing journey." She paused, letting the silence stretch across the massive room. She looked at me with eyes full of fake pity. "We believe in authenticity and setting healthy boundaries. Unfortunately, my daughter Diana is currently battling severe mental health toxicity. Her presence here tonight is deeply triggering for our family dynamic. We have to prioritize our emotional safety and protect this safe space." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I felt blood rush to my face. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. People I had known for years began whispering behind their champagne flutes. Beatrice was weaponizing therapy language to humiliate me publicly, painting herself as the brave victim while branding me as insane. It was a masterclass in manipulation designed to push me over the edge. "Security," Beatrice said softly into the microphone, her voice dripping with fake compassion. "Please escort Diana out. We want to send her off with love and light, but she cannot stay here." I looked over at the VIP table. Preston was smirking, barely hiding his cruel amusement. He loved seeing me humiliated. Kendra stood beside him, quietly sipping her drink. She watched me closely to see how I would react to the absolute destruction of my public dignity. 2 large security guards in black suits quickly approached me. One of them nervously gestured toward the main exit. "Miss, please come with us," he muttered, looking entirely embarrassed. Beatrice was waiting for me to snap. She desperately wanted me to cry, to yell, to make a massive scene that would confirm her narrative about my supposed mental instability. She wanted to prove to 300 people that I was exactly the unhinged villain she claimed I was. Instead of giving her what she wanted, I took a long, deep breath. I smoothed the front of my modest navy dress. I looked right at Beatrice and smiled. A genuine, terrifying smile. I gave a polite nod to the mayor, who looked absolutely horrified. I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand double doors. I did not rush. I kept my head high, letting the rhythmic click of my heels echo in the dead silent ballroom. I walked out into the cool evening air without saying a single word. I did not need to speak. I knew exactly what was waiting for them in the dark, and they had absolutely no idea what I was about to do next. The valet brought my car around to the front of the hotel. I tipped him and slipped into the quiet sanctuary of my vehicle. The heavy doors shut instantly, cutting off the faint sounds of the string quartet that had resumed playing inside. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, letting the cool leather calm my nerves. Beatrice and Preston thought they had won. They thought public humiliation was the ultimate weapon, but they were playing a social game while I was playing a financial one. I reached over to the passenger seat and unzipped my leather tote bag. I pulled out my laptop, resting it on the center console. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark interior of the car. My fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, bypassing the standard login screen, to access a secure encrypted drive I had maintained for the past 5 years. When my father Thomas passed away half a decade ago, he left the hotel empire to the family. He loved that business, but he also knew his son. He knew Preston had the business sense of a teenager with a stolen credit card, but Beatrice had insisted Preston take the reins as chief executive officer. Within 6 months of taking over, Preston began missing mortgage payments. He took out reckless loans to fund his lavish lifestyle using the hotel property as collateral. He bought sports cars and threw outrageous parties, all while the business bled money. What Preston and Beatrice never knew was that when the bank prepared to seize the property 3 years ago, I stepped in. I did not do it out of love for them. I did it because my father built that hotel from the ground up, and I refused to let some faceless corporate equity firm dismantle his life work. Using my own earnings and a small inheritance, my father secretly left me. I bought the toxic debt through an anonymous holding company. I became the senior lien holder. Every time Preston defaulted, I quietly covered the margins to keep the doors open, waiting for the right moment to act. I gave them every chance to turn things around, but tonight proved they were beyond saving. I opened the secure banking portal. The interface was sterile, a sharp contrast to the messy family drama it represented. I navigated to the commercial lending dashboard. There it was, the master file for the hotel property. The current outstanding debt was staggering. Preston had missed his last 4 payments, completely unaware that the shadowy corporate entity holding his financial life in its hands was actually his own sister sitting in the parking lot. I typed in my master passcode. A prompt appeared on the screen asking for final confirmation to execute the foreclosure clause. According to the ironclad contract Preston had signed without reading, the senior lien holder had the right to immediately seize all assets, including the land deed and the operating accounts, upon the 4th consecutive default. He had signed his own financial death warrant, and Beatrice had just handed me the pen to finalize it. I looked out the car window at the brightly lit hotel lobby. I could see guests laughing and drinking, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground was about to be sold out from under their feet. Beatrice was probably holding court near the ice sculpture, soaking in the sympathy of her wealthy friends. Preston was likely ordering another expensive bottle of champagne on the company tab. They felt untouchable. I took one final breath, centering myself. I felt no guilt. I felt no hesitation. I pressed the enter key. The screen loaded for a fraction of a second before a green confirmation banner stretched across the top. The transfer protocol initiated immediately. The hotel deed, the valuable downtown land it sat on, and the $17 million in the commercial operating fund were instantly frozen, pulled from his control, and diverted directly into an irrevocable trust in my name. The action was irreversible. The money was gone. The property was mine. The hotel they were currently partying in no longer belonged to them. I closed the laptop and slipped it back into my bag. I started the engine, pulling out of the circular driveway and merging onto the quiet evening streets of Chicago. The city lights blurred past my windows. I felt lighter than I had in years. For my entire life, Beatrice had tried to make me feel small, and Preston had tried to make me feel powerless. Tonight I stripped them of the only thing they truly cared about. I drove toward my quiet townhouse, knowing that the champagne inside that ballroom was about to turn very sour right now, this very minute before midnight struck the grand clock. The grand clock on my dashboard read 11:15 as I pulled into the quiet driveway of my townhouse. The contrast between my peaceful neighborhood and the chaotic ballroom I had just left could not have been more extreme. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the absolute silence. I did not rush inside. I took my time enjoying the calm before the inevitable storm. I unlocked my front door, stepped into the hallway, and tossed my keys onto the entryway table. I kicked off my heels and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of cold water. My house was modest compared to the sprawling estates my family preferred, but I owned it outright. There were no hidden liens, no secret mortgages, and no impending threats of bankruptcy. It was my safe haven. I set my glass down on the granite counter and pulled my laptop out of my tote bag once more. I needed to verify that the digital dust had settled. As a forensic accountant, I never assumed a transaction was complete until the final ledger updated. I opened my laptop, logged back into the secure portal, and reviewed the confirmation logs. The numbers stared back at me in stark black and white. The entire $17 million operating fund had been successfully routed through the automated clearinghouse system. It bypassed the standard corporate holding accounts and landed squarely inside the protective walls of my newly activated irrevocable trust. The trust was practically a fortress. Once the assets were inside, they could not be touched, modified, or reversed by anyone, not even me, without a mountain of legal paperwork and federal oversight. The land deed and the hotel operating licenses had also been digitally reassigned. The state registry had already accepted the automated filing. Preston was currently serving drinks in a building he no longer owned, spending money from accounts that were entirely drained. The sheer arrogance of his financial negligence had made the entire process incredibly smooth. He had ignored every automated warning the banking system had sent him over the past 4 months. He probably thought they were junk mail or minor clerical errors that his accounting team would handle. He never bothered to read the fine print of his own destruction. I closed the laptop and carried my water glass into the living room. I sat down on my sofa, resting my head against the cushions. I wondered how it would happen. Would Preston try to pay the catering staff? Would Beatrice try to run her platinum credit card to cover the extravagant ice sculptures? The commercial accounts were tethered directly to the hotel operating fund. Any transaction attempted right now would hit a massive echoing void. The bank would immediately issue a hard decline. A freeze order of this magnitude would trigger an automatic alert to the chief executive officer. Preston would get an email, then a text, and then a phone call from the fraud department. Right on cue, my cell phone vibrated against the glass coffee table. The sudden buzzing shattered the quiet atmosphere of my living room. I leaned forward and looked at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed my brother's name. I did not pick up. I simply watched the screen flash until the call went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it vibrated again. Then a text message appeared. Pick up the phone right now. Then another text. What did you do to the accounts? Then another. Call me back immediately. I picked up the phone and unlocked it, watching the notifications cascade down my screen in real time. The sheer panic radiating through the digital text was palpable. Preston was realizing that his entire empire had evaporated into thin air. He was no longer the wealthy hotel magnate. He was a man with $0 to his name, standing in a room full of powerful people he could no longer afford to impress. The phone rang again, this time from my mother. I silenced it. Within 15 minutes, my screen had lit up with frantic notifications. I had exactly 58 missed calls from Preston and Beatrice combined. Voicemails were piling up, each one likely more unhinged than the last. The money was gone. The property was gone. Their untouchable status was completely obliterated. I set the phone face down on the table, took a calm sip of water, and looked toward my front door. I knew they were not going to stop at phone calls. They were desperate, angry, and severely humiliated by this revelation. It was almost midnight, and I knew exactly where they were heading next. The motion sensor light flared, and heavy fists hammered loudly against my heavy wooden front door. I did not flinch when the pounding started. I simply stood up from my sofa, smoothed my dress, and walked slowly toward the entryway. The heavy fists hitting the wood belonged to my brother. I could hear Preston breathing heavily, demanding I open the door right this instant. Beside him, Beatrice was talking in a sharp, hushed tone, telling him to step back and let her handle the situation. I paused behind the door, listening to their panic. For my entire life, their voices outside my room meant I was about to be punished or belittled. But tonight, the power dynamic had completely shifted. I unlocked the deadbolt, but kept my foot firmly planted at the base, opening it just enough to see them. Preston looked like a wreck. His velvet dinner jacket was unbuttoned, his bow tie was undone, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Beatrice stood slightly in front of him, her emerald silk dress looking completely out of place on my modest front porch. Behind them both stood Kendra, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She was watching me with an intense, calculating gaze. She had not said a word, but I could tell her brilliant mind was already trying to piece together the financial puzzle her husband had dragged her into. "Diana, sweetheart." Beatrice began, her voice dripping with that familiar, sickeningly sweet tone she used whenever she wanted to manipulate a crowd. "We know you are having a severe manic episode right now. We are not angry. We are just very concerned about your mental safety. You left the gala so abruptly, and now you are playing dangerous games on your computer." I stared at her blankly. I did not let them step 1 inch over my threshold. Honey, Beatrice continued, stepping closer to the door crack. "You need to log back into whatever portal you hacked and transfer the funds back to the hotel immediately. If you do this right now, we can sweep this under the rug. I will even personally pay for a top-tier psychiatrist to help you work through these destructive impulses. We want to help you heal, Diana, but you have to undo this horrible mistake." Preston could not hold back anymore. He shoved his way forward, his face red with rage. "It is not a mistake, Mother," he yelled, spit flying from his lips. "She completely drained the commercial accounts. My cards are declining. The catering company is threatening to walk out of the ballroom. Turn the money back over right now, or I am calling the police and having you arrested for federal wire fraud." I looked at my brother, taking in his absolute desperation. "You cannot call the police." "Preston," I said calmly, my voice steady and cold in the night air. "Because I did not steal anything. I executed a legal financial maneuver on an asset that was surrendered due to gross negligence." Preston grabbed the edge of the door, trying to pull it open wider, but I held my ground. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his eyes wide and panicked. "You are a forensic accountant, not a bank. You have no legal right to touch my money or my property." Kendra stepped forward slightly, her sharp eyes darting between my calm face and her husband's sweating forehead. "What did he surrender, Diana?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the chaotic shouting. Instead of arguing with my mother about my sanity or fighting with my brother about his bruised ego, I reached over to the small entryway table. Earlier, I had anticipated this exact confrontation. I had printed out the official bank statement alongside the senior lienholder foreclosure notification. I rolled the thick pieces of paper into a tight cylinder and passed them through the narrow opening of the door, holding them out to Preston. He snatched the papers, his hands shaking violently as he unrolled them under the glare of my porch light. Beatrice leaned over his shoulder in confusion. Preston scanned the top of the document. I watched the exact moment his brain comprehended the logo of the shadow lending company he had secretly borrowed money from 6 months ago. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He stopped breathing for a few seconds. Beatrice looked at him, demanding to know what the paper actually said, but Preston could not form a single coherent sentence. Kendra leaned in closer, her eyes quickly scanning the bold text at the very bottom of the white page. It clearly stated that the entire hotel property was legally repossessed. I stepped back and looked at the three of them standing frozen in the cold. I had just handed them their absolute financial ruin on a printed silver platter. The silence on my porch was deafening. The shock wore off, and Preston reacted exactly how a cornered animal would. He let out a loud, hollow laugh. It was a forced, ugly sound that echoed into the quiet neighborhood. "This is a joke," he sneered, his hands gripping the edges of the printed bank statement so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You printed this off the internet to scare me. You think because you play with numbers all day, you can forge a document and claim you own my property." Suddenly, Preston ripped the thick paper right down the middle. He tore it again and again, letting the shredded pieces flutter down onto my welcome mat like snow. "I have the original deed, Diana," he spat, pointing at my face. "Dad gave it to me. It is sitting in the master safe in my office. A piece of paper with a fake logo on it does not magically erase my ownership. You are delusional, and tomorrow morning I am going completely scorch earth on you with my lawyers." Beatrice quickly stepped up to support him, though her eyes betrayed a deep, unsettled panic. She glared at me. "See what you have done?" she scolded, her tone shifting from fake concern to pure venom. "You are pushing your brother to his limit. This little stunt of yours is exactly why your father never trusted you with the business. You let jealousy rot your brain." I looked at the shredded paper on the ground, completely unbothered. "Tearing up a printout does not delete the registry, Preston," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "I did not hack your accounts. I did not forge a single signature. I foreclosed on you." Preston stopped breathing. His bravado fractured instantly. "You put the hotel up as collateral." I continued enunciating every word clearly, so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. 6 months ago, when the traditional banks finally cut you off because of your massive defaults, you panicked. You went to a shadow lender in Vegas to secure a high-interest bridge loan to keep your lifestyle afloat. You thought you could flip the revenue before anyone noticed, but you failed. You missed 4 consecutive payments. Preston stumbled back half a step. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Beatrice looked at him confused and horrified. "Preston," she whispered, her hands trembling. "What is she talking about? You told me the hotel was generating record profits." He ignored her, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "How do you know about Vegas?" He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I bought your debt," I replied smoothly. "I used an anonymous holding company to purchase your defaulted loan directly from the shadow lender. They were thrilled to offload your toxic asset for a lump sum. The moment I bought it, I became the senior lien holder. That means I own the loan, I own the terms, and as of tonight, I own the hotel. The deed in your safe is completely worthless now. The county clerk processed the transfer electronically 20 minutes ago." The reality of the situation crashed down on Preston like a physical weight. He reached out and grabbed the porch railing to steady himself, looking like he was about to be physically sick. Beatrice covered her mouth, finally realizing that her golden child had not only lied to her, but had gambled away their entire legacy. But the most dangerous reaction did not come from my mother or my brother. It came from Kendra. Up until this moment, Kendra had been standing rigidly behind them, absorbing every piece of information like a supercomputer processing a fatal error. When she heard the words Vegas and Shadowlender, her entire demeanor shifted. The protective, supportive wife routine vanished instantly. Her sharp, intelligent eyes widened, and a terrifying coldness settled over her features. She slowly turned her head to look at her husband. "Preston," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a deadly weight that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Preston, look at me." He refused to meet her eyes, staring blankly at my front door instead. "Tell me she is lying," Kendra demanded, her voice cracking with suppressed rage. "Tell me you did not leverage our entire future with loan sharks without telling me. Tell me you did not secretly bankrupt the company I personally guaranteed the renovation loans for." Preston remained entirely silent, sweat pouring down his face as he stared at the ground. His silence was the loudest confession he could give. Kendra froze completely. Her chest heaved as the catastrophic reality set in. Her husband had hidden massive illegal debts, and she was now firmly tied to a sinking ship. Kendra's realization ignited Preston's explosive temper. He yelled and lunged forward, slamming his body weight against the door. I kept my foot planted against the base, my shoulder braced against the frame. The wood groaned under the impact, but I did not budge an inch. "Open this door right now!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. His face was pressed near the gap, contorted into a mask of pure rage. "You think you can steal an $18 million empire from your blood and walk away? I am calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You committed wire fraud. You transferred corporate funds across state lines into a private trust. That is a federal crime. You are going to spend the rest of your life rotting inside a federal prison cell." I looked at him through the opening, unfazed by his buzzwords. He was throwing terms around without understanding how they worked. I did not steal corporate funds. I reminded him, my voice cutting through his screaming like ice. I executed a lawful seizure of a collateralized asset after 4 consecutive defaults. The transfer was authorized by the exact contract you signed in Vegas. You gave them the keys, Preston. I just happened to buy the locks. Beatrice pushed past Kendra, tears finally streaming down her face. She grabbed Preston's arm, pulling him back slightly so she could look directly at me. Her mask of high society elegance was completely shattered. "Diana, please," she begged, her voice wavering with dramatic sobs. "You cannot possibly do this to us. You are destroying your father's legacy. He built that hotel from the ground up. He poured his blood, sweat, and tears into those walls to give us a good life. How can you defile his memory like this? You are letting your toxic childhood trauma dictate your reckless actions. You need to let go of this vindictive anger and heal your inner child. We are your family." I stared at my mother, feeling a familiar wave of disgust wash over me. She was still actively trying to use therapy speak to gaslight me into submission, even as her entire world burned down to ash around her. "You do not get to invoke his memory," I said coldly. "Dad left you both a pristine, debt-free legacy. You are the ones who destroyed it. You let Preston treat the company accounts like a personal piggy bank. You intentionally looked the other way while he took out predatory commercial loans to fund your lavish lifestyle and his fragile ego. You defiled his memory the exact moment you handed the chief executive officer title to a man who cannot even balance a basic checkbook." Beatrice gasped, loudly, clutching a shaking hand to her chest, as if I had physically struck her. "You are sick," she whispered, her tears flowing faster now. "You are truly, deeply sick." Preston slammed his hand against the doorframe again, leaving a smudge on the white paint. "My lawyers are going to bury you," he threatened, his breathing ragged and uneven. "I am filing an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning. I will have a superior court judge freeze your accounts, freeze your trust, and lock you out of everything you own. You will not see a single dime of that money, and I will personally make sure you are disbarred and ruined in this city. You will never work as a forensic accountant again." I nodded slowly, absorbing his desperate threats without a single ounce of fear or hesitation. "Do whatever you feel you need to do, Preston," I replied quietly. "But understand this one simple fact. The moment you file that legal injunction, everything automatically goes on the public record. Every hidden debt, every defaulted payment, and every fraudulent document you submitted to that shadow lender will become public knowledge. The investors will see it. The executive board will see it. And most importantly, the Internal Revenue Service will see it. So go ahead. Call your lawyers." Preston hesitated, the terrifying reality of my words hitting him hard. The threat of an audit was the ultimate paralyzing force. I looked past him to Kendra, who was already pulling her phone out of her designer purse, her face an unreadable mask of cold calculation. Then I looked back at my brother and my mother standing on my porch in the freezing night air, completely stripped of their power and their foolish pride. "I will see you in court," I said softly. Before either of them could formulate another word, I removed my foot from the base, stepped back, and slammed the heavy wooden door completely shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a loud final thud. I turned the security lock and walked away, leaving them standing in the dark. The night passed in absolute silence. I slept better than I had in years, waking up at 6 in the morning with a clear mind. I dressed in my sharpest charcoal suit, grabbed my briefcase, and drove to my corporate accounting firm downtown. I knew Preston was not going to quietly accept his defeat. He was a man who relied on brute force intimidation and expensive favors to get his way. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting at my glass desk, sipping my black coffee, and reviewing client portfolios, waiting for his inevitable counterattack. It did not take long to materialize. At exactly 8:15, the heavy glass doors of my firm swung open. My assistant looked up in alarm as two uniformed officers marched right past the reception desk without stopping to ask for permission or sign the visitor log. Leading the pair was Sheriff Miller, a loud, aggressive man who spent most of his weekends drinking premium scotch and playing 18 holes of golf with my brother at the exclusive local country club. Preston had clearly cashed in a major favor to get him here this early. Sheriff Miller stomped straight into my office, his hand resting heavily on his thick utility belt. He deliberately chose not to close the glass door behind him, making absolutely sure that my colleagues in the open bullpen could hear every single word of our conversation. "Diana," he barked, his rough voice echoing off the walls, "I am serving you with an emergency legal injunction. You are to immediately reverse the wire transfer you initiated last night and restore the commercial accounts to your brother. If you refuse to comply, I am going to walk you out of this building in handcuffs for criminal corporate sabotage." I did not stand up from my chair. I did not act surprised, and I certainly did not act intimidated by his theatrical entrance. I set my pen down, folded my hands together, and looked up at him. I noticed his face was flushed, likely from a mix of morning adrenaline and a rush to please his wealthy country club buddy. "Let me see the paperwork, Sheriff," I requested, calmly extending my right hand. He sneered and slammed a thick manila folder violently onto my desk. I opened the cover and quickly scanned the first page. It was a hastily drafted emergency injunction filed by Preston and his team of expensive corporate lawyers. The document demanded an immediate freeze on all my personal assets, claiming I had used unauthorized digital access to drain company funds. It was a bluff wrapped in legal jargon. "You do not have time to read the entire thing," Miller interrupted abruptly, stepping closer to my desk to loom over my seated figure. "The county judge signed it an hour ago. You need to pull out your computer log into your banking portal right now and send the money back to the hotel operating fund. Preston is willing to drop the criminal charges if you comply immediately. We can keep this entire situation quiet, Diana. You really do not want to ruin your professional career over a petty family squabble." I closed the manila folder and pushed it back across the smooth glass surface toward him. "A civil injunction is not a criminal arrest warrant, Sheriff," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly even and professional. "You have absolutely no legal authority to arrest me over a disputed commercial asset seizure. Furthermore, you cannot force me to reverse a completed financial transaction without a full evidentiary hearing in front of a judge. You are operating far outside your actual jurisdiction right now, and you know it." Miller flushed a deep shade of crimson, his anger flaring at my blatant defiance. He unclipped the metal handcuffs from his belt, letting them clink loudly together to emphasize his threat. "Listen to me very carefully," he growled, leaning his heavy frame over my desk. "Your brother is an important man in this city. You stole $18 million from his business. That makes you a thief. I am not going to stand here and argue civil code with a stubborn accountant. You are either going to transfer that money back right this very second, or I am going to arrest you for grand larceny perp, walk you through this entire office, and let you spend the weekend sitting in a holding cell while we sort out the paperwork on Monday morning." He reached forward and grabbed my upper arm, his grip tight, bruising, and meant to cause pain. Several of my coworkers gasped, standing up from their cubicles to watch the commotion unfold. He was trying to publicly humiliate me, using the exact same intimidation playbook my mother had used at the gala just hours before. Before the sheriff could tighten his grip any further, the soft chime of the elevator doors opening echoed through the silent office. A tall man in a tailored navy suit stepped out carrying a sleek leather briefcase. It was Mr. Campbell, my personal corporate attorney. He took one look at the situation, his eyes narrowing behind his silver-rimmed glasses, and walked briskly toward my desk. "Take your hand off my client this instant, Sheriff Miller," Mr. Campbell demanded, his voice projecting a natural, unquestionable authority that made the sheriff immediately loosen his grip and step back. "You are currently assaulting a senior executive in her place of business over a civil dispute. If you do not step away from her desk, I will personally ensure your badge and your pension are revoked before the mayor even finishes his morning coffee." Sheriff Miller puffed out his chest, trying to maintain his intimidating posture, but the sudden arrival of high-powered legal counsel clearly rattled him. He crossed his arms and glared at Mr. Campbell. "She is in violation of a superior court injunction," Miller fired back, pointing a thick finger at my face. "Her brother filed the paperwork this morning. She illegally transferred $18 million out of a corporate account. I have the authority to detain her until the funds are restored." Mr. Campbell did not argue. He simply popped open his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick document bound with a blue legal cover, and placed it squarely on top of Preston's flimsy injunction folder. "That injunction is entirely null and void," Mr. Campbell stated smoothly, "because the man who filed it never actually owned the assets he claims were stolen. Read the certified document, Sheriff. It is a fully executed trust agreement signed by Thomas himself exactly 5 years ago." Sheriff Miller frowned, his bravado slipping as he picked up the heavy document. He flipped past the official notary seals and began scanning the dense legal paragraphs. I watched his face closely, seeing the exact moment his confidence shattered. The truth was finally out in the open. For 5 long years, Beatrice and Preston paraded around the city acting like they had inherited the entire empire. They believed my father Thomas had blindly handed over his life work to his golden child son. But my father was a sharp businessman. He loved his family, but he was not stupid. He knew exactly who my mother was. He knew Beatrice was obsessed with status and would spend every dime she could reach. More importantly, he knew Preston was arrogant, lazy, and completely incapable of running a complex commercial enterprise. Before his death, my father came to my apartment late one night. He was already sick, looking frail but incredibly determined. He told me he was leaving Preston in charge as the public face of the company simply to appease Beatrice and avoid a massive family war during his final days. But behind the scenes, my father drafted a secret, ironclad legal structure. He established an irrevocable trust and named me as the sole trustee and ultimate protector of the family assets. He built a specific mechanism into the trust which Mr. Campbell referred to as the poison pill clause. It was designed to remain completely dormant as long as Preston managed the hotel responsibly. But the clause had very specific trigger conditions. If Preston ever attempted to leverage the core property illegally, if he ever defaulted on commercial loans, or if he ever tried to use shadow lenders to hide financial losses, the poison pill would immediately activate. It granted me the absolute legal right to step in as a senior debt buyer, foreclose on the property, and absorb the entire empire into the protective shell of the trust. I did not act out of spite last night. I acted on the direct, legally binding orders of the original founder. Preston had tripped the wire when he took that dirty loan in Vegas. The trust activated, granting me full authorization to execute the transfer. The money and the land never belonged to Preston in the first place. They belonged to the trust, just waiting for him to fail. Sheriff Miller slowly flipped to the final page, staring at my father's unmistakable signature next to a state judge's seal of approval. The sheriff swallowed hard, the color completely draining from his face. He quickly realized he had just walked into a massive federal-level financial trap, armed with nothing but a worthless piece of paper his golf buddy had hastily drafted. The assets were untouchable. My father had reached beyond the grave to strip Preston of his unearned power, and there was absolutely nothing the local police or a corrupt judge could do to stop it from happening now. Sheriff Miller stood completely frozen in the center of my office. His thick fingers visibly trembled as he held the heavy legal document my attorney had just provided. The aggressive demeanor he had walked in with evaporated the moment his brain processed the impenetrable wall of federal trust law he was suddenly up against. He looked up from the pages, his eyes darting nervously between Mr. Campbell and me. Well, the sheriff muttered, his voice dropping several octaves as he tried to find a way to gracefully retreat. This appears to be a highly complex civil dispute. It is completely outside the scope of local law enforcement. Mr. Campbell did not offer him an easy way out. He stepped closer, his posture perfectly rigid and professional. It is not a dispute, Sheriff Miller. A dispute implies there is an argument over ownership. There is no argument here. My client is the sole legal trustee of an irrevocable asset structure designed by the original founder. Preston holds zero equity, zero leverage, and zero standing in any court of law. If you or your department attempt to enforce that fraudulent injunction, we will immediately file a federal lawsuit against the county for severe civil rights violations and illegal asset seizure. The young associate lawyer from Preston's expensive firm, who had quietly trailed behind the sheriff, hoping for an easy intimidation tactic, suddenly looked physically ill. The associate awkwardly grabbed the flimsy manila folder off my desk and tried to step backward toward the hallway, realizing his firm had just billed my brother for a completely useless and legally disastrous piece of paper. They had confidently filed an emergency injunction without conducting a basic title search on the underlying corporate collateral. It was a humiliating rookie mistake that would cost their firm its reputation the moment this hit the public record. Sheriff Miller swallowed heavily, handing the certified trust document back to my attorney. He refused to look me in the eye. I am just doing my job based on the sworn affidavits provided to a judge this morning. He stammered frantically, trying to distance himself from his wealthy golf buddy. I will inform the Superior Court that the injunction is contested and cannot be enforced by my department. Have a good day, ma'am. The sheriff turned on his heel and marched out of my office, walking twice as fast as he had when he entered. The young associate lawyer practically sprinted after him, desperate to escape the disastrous situation. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, and the suffocating tension in the room finally broke. The bullpen outside my office erupted into hushed whispers. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. Mr. Campbell placed the trust document carefully back into his leather briefcase and clicked the locks shut. They are going to scramble now, he noted calmly, sitting down in one of the guest chairs opposite my desk. Preston will likely try to freeze the subsidiary accounts, but I have already sent preemptive notices to all the regional banks. The poison pill clause covers the entire financial ecosystem. They cannot touch a single dollar without my explicit legal authorization. Thank you, I replied softly, feeling a genuine wave of gratitude for his flawless execution. My father chose the right man to protect his legacy. Your father knew exactly what was coming, Mr. Campbell said, offering a rare, knowing smile. He wanted to ensure you had the ultimate shield when the time came. The shield is now fully deployed. Just be careful, Diana. Cornered animals are unpredictable. Preston and your mother have lost their money and their social standing. They will not go quietly into the night. I nodded, fully aware that the war was far from over. Mr. Campbell stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and left my office to continue filing our defensive motions at the federal courthouse. I sat back down in my chair, finally alone in the quiet space. The morning had unfolded exactly as I had predicted. The legal attack was neutralized before it even began. I turned my attention back to my computer monitor, ready to resume my actual job. Then my cell phone vibrated on the glass desk. The sudden buzzing shattered the calm silence. I reached over and picked it up. The screen illuminated with a new text message. I did not recognize the phone number. I unlocked the device and opened the notification. The message was incredibly brief, devoid of any polite greetings or family pleasantries. It consisted of just 5 clear words. We need to talk, alone. The sender had signed her name at the very bottom of the glowing screen. She was the only person in my family who actually understood the danger. It was Kendra. I responded to the message with a time and the address of a quiet coffee shop near the financial district. I arrived 10 minutes early, ordering a simple black tea and taking a seat in a secluded leather booth near the back window. Exactly on time, Kendra walked through the heavy glass doors. She was not dressed in the glamorous evening wear from the Hotel Gala last night. She wore a sharp-tailored business suit, her posture rigid, and her expression utterly unreadable. She spotted me, immediately walked over, and slid into the booth opposite me without bothering to order a drink. We stared at each other for a long moment in complete silence. Kendra was entirely unlike my mother or my brother. She was incredibly intelligent, wildly ambitious, and deeply protective of her personal interests. She did not operate on blind emotion or foolish pride. She calculated every single move she made. "You completely destroyed him last night," Kendra began, her voice remarkably low and steady despite the chaos. He spent the entire morning screaming at his incompetent lawyers and throwing things around his home office. But I did not come here to defend my husband, Diana. I came here to protect myself. I took a slow, measured sip of my warm tea. "I am listening to you," I replied softly. Kendra leaned forward, placing her expensive designer handbag carefully on the wooden table between us. 2 years ago, Preston came to me with a massive business proposal. He wanted to do a modern renovation of the hotel lobby and the premium luxury suites. He told me the business was thriving, but that all the liquid capital was currently tied up in long-term investments. He asked me to use my interior design firm as a primary partner and to personally guarantee the renovation loans to secure a much lower interest rate. He swore to me it was just a minor legal formality. I felt a brief flicker of genuine pity for her situation. "You signed a personal guarantee on commercial debt for Preston," I stated, already knowing exactly how disastrous that decision was. "I trusted my husband." Kendra snapped back, a sudden flash of genuine anger breaking through her composed exterior. "Because I believed his fabricated financial reports. But last night, when you handed over that foreclosure notice, I realized he had lied to me about everything. If you seize the hotel and wipe out the operating accounts, those renovation loans will default immediately. The banks will not be able to go after the hotel property because it is now fully protected by your federal trust. They will come directly after me. They will liquidate my design firm, seize my personal assets, and bankrupt me to cover his massive debt. I refuse to let that happen." She unzipped her handbag and pulled out her smartphone, sliding it across the table toward me. The screen was open to an audio file. "I am not asking you to give the hotel back to Preston," Kendra continued, her tone turning completely icy. "I know he lost it fairly due to his incompetence, but I am demanding that you drop the foreclosure proceedings just long enough for me to legally detach my name from those toxic loans. If you refuse to help me, I will destroy your professional reputation before the sun sets today." I looked down at the glowing phone, then back up at her intense gaze. "How exactly do you plan to do that?" I asked quietly. Pressing a play button on the screen, Kendra played a secretly recorded conversation. It was my voice, crystal clear, sounding highly agitated. The recording caught me saying that I knew exactly how to manipulate corporate ledgers to hide missing funds from federal auditors, and that I could easily make millions of dollars disappear without a single trace. It was a brief snippet from a heated argument I had with Preston 3 years ago, where I was angrily explaining exactly how his reckless bookkeeping looked to a trained forensic auditor. But completely stripped of its original context, it sounded exactly like a recorded confession from a corrupt accountant offering to commit federal wire fraud. "I have a contact at a major financial news outlet," Kendra threatened, her eyes locking fiercely onto mine. "If I send them this audio file, your career is instantly over. No corporate client will ever trust you with their private books again. The state board will revoke your accounting license, and your firm will terminate you by tomorrow morning. You will be as ruined as I am. So you have a clear choice, Diana. You can pause the foreclosure right now, or we can both burn to the ground today." I simply sat back and listened calmly to her threats. When she finally finished speaking, the small coffee shop felt completely silent, despite the hum of the espresso machine in the background. She watched my face, expecting to see panic or desperation. She expected me to beg for my career, much like my brother had begged for his empire the night before. Instead, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my silver iPad. I woke, the screen tapped in a passcode, and opened a highly detailed digital file I had prepared specifically for this exact encounter. I slid the device slowly across the smooth wooden table until it rested directly in front of her. You are a brilliant interior designer, Kendra. I began keeping my voice soft but incredibly firm. You know exactly what commercial renovations cost. You know the price of imported marble custom lighting fixtures and union labor. Look at the screen. Kendra frowned, her eyes darting from my face to the glowing tablet. She leaned forward and began scrolling through the document. It was a comprehensive ledger detailing the exact flow of the loan money she had personally guaranteed. As she read the line items, her frown deepened into a look of absolute confusion. There are no invoices here for construction materials, she whispered, her finger hovering over the screen. There are no payments to architectural firms or general contractors. What am I looking at, Diana? You are looking at a masterclass in financial deception, I explained. When Preston took out those loans under the guise of upgrading the hotel, he immediately transferred the funds into a secondary corporate account. From there, he washed the money through 3 different shell companies registered in Delaware. He did this to make the trail incredibly difficult for standard auditors to follow. But I am not a standard auditor. I tracked every single penny. He did not spend a single dollar of that loan money on the hotel. Kendra looked up, her sharp eyes searching my face. Then where did the money go? She asked, her voice tight with rising anxiety. Scroll to the 4th page, I instructed. She swiped her finger across the glass. The screen displayed a certified property deed and a series of high-resolution photographs. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern luxury mansion located in one of the most exclusive gated communities in Miami. It featured a massive infinity pool floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the ocean and a pristine white driveway. I reached across the table and tapped the screen one last time, bringing up the residency documents tied to the property. Because he needed a place to house his mistress, I revealed quietly. Kendra stopped breathing. Her eyes locked onto the name printed clearly on the utility bills and the homeowner association registry. It was a woman she recognized, a woman who had attended their wedding, a woman Preston claimed was just an old college friend who occasionally did consulting work for the hotel. He has been flying down to Miami every other weekend for the past 2 years. I continued, offering no comfort, but providing the absolute truth. He told you he was attending regional hospitality conferences. He was actually living a second life in a mansion funded entirely by the debt he forced you to guarantee. You are on the hook for millions of dollars, Kendra, and he spent it all on her. The tough, calculating exterior that Kendra had worn into the coffee shop shattered completely. I watched the realization physically strike her. The betrayal was absolute. It was not just financial ruin. It was a deep, humiliating personal destruction. Her hands began to shake violently. She dropped her phone, the device clattering loudly against the table. The audio recording of my supposed confession completely forgotten. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her dark lashes and tracing paths down her makeup. She covered her mouth with her trembling hand, letting out a quiet, choked sob that broke my heart. She had played the game perfectly. She had married the golden child, built her own successful business, and secured her place in the wealthy elite. But she had tied her anchor to a man who possessed no moral compass. He destroyed her life. I gave her a moment to process the devastating reality. I did not reach across the table to comfort her. Pity was the last thing a woman like Kendra needed right now. She needed a strategy. I watched as the initial shock washed through her system, the quiet sobs slowly subsiding. She took a deep breath, reaching into her purse to pull out a pristine white handkerchief. She carefully dabbed the ruined makeup under her eyes, her movement slow and deliberate. When she finally lowered her hand, the devastated, heartbroken wife was entirely gone. In her place sat a furious, calculating survivor. Her dark eyes, previously shining with unshed tears, turned completely cold and hard as obsidian. The transformation was terrifying and magnificent to witness. She placed her hands flat on the wooden table, her manicured nails tapping lightly against the surface. "I am going to bury him," she stated. Her voice held no tremor, no hesitation. It was a simple, absolute promise of destruction. "I will not let him drag my business and my reputation down into the dirt just so he can play house in Miami with some cheap consultant. But I cannot do it alone, Diana. I need your help to untangle my name from those commercial loans before the bank executes the default clauses. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. You signed a personal guarantee, Kendra. That is a binding legal contract. Breaking you out of that liability requires massive leverage against the lending institution or proof of extreme deliberate fraud on Preston's part that directly invalidates your signature. I have the digital trail of his shell companies, but proving he intentionally defrauded you to secure the loan requires more than just bank statements. It requires his explicit internal records. Kendra's lips curled into a sharp, vindictive smile. She picked up her phone, the one she had threatened me with just minutes ago, and casually tossed it back into her bag. The audio recording no longer mattered. We were on the exact same side now. Preston thinks he is a criminal mastermind, she said, leaning closer so her voice barely carried over the table. But he is actually just paranoid and careless. He does not trust digital cloud servers for his truly illegal transactions. He thinks hackers or people like you can trace everything online. So for the money he siphons off to pay his shadow lenders and fund his secret life, he keeps a separate set of books. Physical ledgers. My forensic accountant instincts instantly flared. Physical ledgers, I repeated, keeping my excitement carefully concealed. Are you absolutely sure they exist? I have seen them, Kendra confirmed. He keeps them locked inside a vintage floor safe hidden in the basement archives of the old family estate. Beatrice thinks it is just a storage room for old hotel furniture and tax returns from the 90s. But Preston goes down there twice a month. I caught him once, and he claimed he was reviewing grandfather's old business journals. I knew he was lying, but I did not push it. Now I know exactly what he was doing. Those ledgers contain every single dirty transaction, every illegal wire transfer, and the exact proof that he committed federal bank fraud when he secured those renovation loans. Kendra stared at me, laying all her cards on the table. Here is my proposal, Diana. I know the combination to that safe. I memorized it months ago just in case. I will go to the estate, retrieve those physical ledgers, and hand them directly over to you. I will give you the exact ammunition you need to lock your brother in a federal prison cell for the next decade. In exchange, you use those ledgers to prove to the banks that my signature was obtained under severe criminal fraud. You force them to release my personal guarantee, and you extract me completely from the collateral damage. I calculated the legal variables in my head. If the physical ledgers proved Preston engaged in a premeditated scheme to defraud the commercial bank, the bank would immediately void the original loan structure to avoid federal complicity. They would write off Kendra's guarantee and go straight after Preston's remaining personal assets. It was a brilliant, ruthless, and entirely viable legal strategy. More importantly, those physical books would give me the final pieces of the puzzle to permanently dismantle my family's corrupt empire. I looked silently across the table at Kendra. She was no longer the smug sister-in-law sneering at me from the VIP table. She was now a highly lethal weapon fully loaded and aimed directly at my brother. I reached across the table and extended my right hand. We have a deal, Kendra. Get me those books today and I will save you. I left the coffee shop feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Kendra kept her word. By late afternoon, a secure courier delivered a heavy package directly to my corporate office. Inside were the physical, leather-bound ledgers Preston had so carefully hidden in the basement safe of our old family estate. I locked my office door and spent the entire evening scanning every single page, cross-referencing his frantic handwritten notes with the digital shell companies I had already uncovered. The level of blatant fraud was staggering. He was running a massive financial scam, and he had documented his own crimes in blue ink. I meticulously compiled the damning evidence into several thick red folders, printing out copies for every person who needed to see the undeniable truth. The next morning, my phone chimed with an urgent alert from my attorney. Beatrice and Preston had hastily organized an emergency shareholder meeting at the prestigious Oakbridge Country Club. Preston had invited all the major private investors who had poured millions into the hotel over the last 2 years. I knew exactly what my mother was planning to do. She was terrified of losing her elite status, so she was going to control the public narrative before the truth could leak out. She needed to paint me as the villain to secure the loyalty of the investors. I drove to the country club, taking my time as I navigated the winding manicured driveway. The morning sun reflected brightly off the pristine golf course. When I arrived at the grand entrance, a young valet in a crisp uniform tried to stop me, politely noting that the mahogany room was reserved for a private corporate event and that my name was not on the approved guest list. I ignored him, holding my head high as I walked straight past the front desk and through the opulent lobby. The heavy oak doors of the meeting room were closed tight, but I could easily hear my mother speaking through the club sound system. I cracked the heavy door open just a few inches, allowing myself to see inside without being noticed. Beatrice stood gracefully at a polished wooden podium, dabbing her eyes with a white lace handkerchief. Preston sat in the front row, looking appropriately somber and exhausted. There were 30 wealthy investors seated at the round tables, their expressions a mix of confusion and anger. Beatrice was in the middle of a masterful performance. Her voice trembled with perfectly calibrated sorrow as she looked out at the powerful crowd. "It breaks my heart to stand before you today," Beatrice told the crowd, her voice echoing softly through the silent room. "As many of you know, my daughter Diana has struggled with severe emotional instability and deep trauma for years. We have tried everything to support her healing journey, but she has always harbored a deep toxic jealousy toward her brother. Preston has worked tirelessly to build this hotel into a profitable enterprise for all of us, while Diana sat on the sidelines completely consumed by her own bitter resentment and unresolved childhood anger." Beatrice paused dramatically to let a single perfect tear roll down her cheek. She gripped the edges of the podium as if she were trying to steady herself against the immense weight of her maternal grief. 2 nights ago, during a severe manic episode, she used her forensic accounting credentials to illegally manipulate our secure banking portals. She maliciously froze our operating accounts and is now attempting to claim sole ownership of the hotel to satisfy her own vindictive delusions. But do not worry. Our lawyers are already preparing a massive civil lawsuit to crush her illegal trust and restore your hard-earned investments. We will not let her mental illness destroy what we have built together." The investors began murmuring angrily among themselves. These were ruthless business people who did not care about family drama or emotional healing. They only cared about their profit margins. A wealthy real estate developer in a sharp gray suit stood up, slamming his hand aggressively on the table. He demanded that Preston file federal criminal charges against me immediately. The crowd agreed, their anger boiling over. They were ready to throw me to the wolves based entirely on my mother and her fabricated manipulative therapy speak. I pushed the heavy oak doors wide open. The loud, sharp click of the brass latch echoed like a gunshot through the room, instantly silencing the angry murmurs. Every head turned toward the back of the room. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet. I was not wearing a ball gown this time. I wore my sharp charcoal business suit, and in my arms I carried a stack of bright red folders. I did not wait for my mother to finish her manufactured tears. I walked directly to the front table, completely ignoring Preston, who had suddenly turned the color of chalk. I placed one of the thick red folders in front of Mr. Harrison, the real estate developer, who had just been screaming for my arrest. I handed the second folder to Mrs. Davenport, the chairwoman of a prominent local equity firm, and the third to the regional vice president of the very commercial bank Preston had defrauded. "I am not here to discuss my childhood trauma," I announced, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick tension in the room. "I am here to discuss your money. Open the folders." Beatrice rushed forward, trying to grab the folder out of Mr. Harrison's hands. "You cannot look at those," she cried out, her voice pitching into genuine panic. "She is unwell. Those documents are the delusions of a sick mind trying to frame her own brother." Mr. Harrison smoothly sidestepped her, his eyes narrowing. He was a man who trusted numbers, not tears. He flipped open the red cover and began scanning the first page. Mrs. Davenport and the bank executive did the same. The room descended into an incredibly tense, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of pages turning. I stood perfectly still, letting the data do the talking. What you are looking at are the actual physical ledgers maintained by the chief executive officer of this hotel, I explained calmly, pacing slowly in front of the podium. You will notice they look significantly different from the polished quarterly digital reports you have been receiving for the past 2 years. Specifically, I draw your attention to page 4, which details the supposed record profits from last quarter. Preston jumped up from his chair, his hands shaking so violently he almost knocked over a pitcher of water. Diana, stop, he pleaded, his voice cracking. You do not know how to read those. They are just rough estimates. They are preliminary projections. I ignored him entirely, keeping my focus locked on the 3 powerful investors. The digital reports claimed the hotel generated a net profit of $2.4 million last quarter, I continued. But if you cross-reference that claim with the physical ledger on page 4, you will see the actual revenue from hotel operations was barely enough to cover basic payroll. The $2.4 million did not come from guest bookings, event hosting, or the luxury spa. It came from a series of high-interest commercial bridge loans taken out against the property itself. Mrs. Davenport looked up, her expression turning lethal. Are you saying he used new loan money to pay out our quarterly dividends? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Yes, I confirmed without hesitation. He has been running a localized Ponzi scheme right here in this country club. He could not generate actual revenue, so he continually leveraged the underlying asset using the incoming loan cash to pay the early investors and maintain the illusion of massive success. He kept you completely pacified with fake dividend checks while he secretly drove the company into catastrophic debt. The bank executive slammed his fist down on the table, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet room, and the renovation loans he demanded, his face turning purple with rage. We approved a massive line of credit specifically earmarked for upgrading the lobby and the suites. Where is that money? Flip to page 7, I instructed. You will see a comprehensive list of wire transfers made immediately after the renovation loans cleared. Not a single dollar went to a contractor. The funds were washed through 3 shell companies in Delaware and ultimately used to purchase a luxury estate in Miami entirely in cash. He stole your money to buy a mansion for his mistress. The room exploded. The wealthy investors who just minutes ago had been ready to crucify me on my mother's command turned their collective terrifying rage directly onto Preston and Beatrice. Mr. Harrison threw his red folder directly at Preston's chest, the papers scattering across the carpet. You lied to us, Harrison roared, pointing a trembling finger at my brother. You fabricated financial documents to secure millions in private capital. You are a common thief wearing an expensive suit. Beatrice backed away from the podium, her hands covering her mouth in absolute shock. She looked at Preston, her eyes wide with horror as the reality of his actions finally sank in. She had no idea about the Ponzi scheme or the mistress. She only knew he had lost the hotel, and she had blindly trusted his lie that I was to blame. Preston stumbled backward, looking desperately around the room for an exit. He was entirely surrounded by furious billionaires and powerful executives. The illusion was dead, and he was completely exposed. The illusion was dead, and he was completely exposed. For a brief second, the heavy silence returned, but it was only the quiet intake of breath before a massive hurricane. Then the room completely erupted. The sophisticated, polite veneer of the country club vanished instantly, replaced by the raw, primal anger of incredibly wealthy people realizing they had been swindled. Several investors stood up at once, their chairs scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Voices overlapped in a chaotic chorus of shouting threats and absolute outrage. The real estate developer did not sit back down. He stepped directly toward my brother, his face twisted in unadulterated fury. You are going to rot in a federal penitentiary for this, he yelled, jabbing his finger so close to Preston's face that he physically recoiled. I am calling my legal team right now. We are going to freeze every single asset you have. We will take your cars, we will take your personal bank accounts, and we will take that Miami mansion you bought with our money. Preston held his hands up in a desperate, trembling gesture of surrender. Please, just listen to me. he stammered, his voice entirely drowned out by the angry crowd. It was just a temporary reallocation of funds. I was going to pay it all back. The market shifted and I needed to create liquidity. Mrs. Davenport let out a sharp, bitter laugh that cut through the noise. Liquidity, she mocked, her tone absolutely venomous. You used our investment capital to create a Ponzi scheme and fund your pathetic infidelity. You are not a businessman. You are a con artist. You committed federal wire fraud and bank fraud. You are looking at 20 years minimum, and I will personally make sure the judge throws away the key. The regional bank executive was already on his cell phone, his face pale as he barked urgent orders to his fraud department to lock down every account associated with our family name. The panic in his voice was palpable. He knew his own career was on the line for approving the massive loans that Preston had so casually stolen. It was at this moment of absolute chaos that Beatrice decided to intervene. She could not comprehend that her social standing was evaporating before her very eyes. She still believed she could manipulate this crowd exactly the way she had manipulated our family for decades. She stepped in front of Preston, holding her hands out in a placating gesture, her emerald silk dress looking utterly ridiculous amidst the financial carnage. "Everyone, please," Beatrice pleaded, raising her voice to a desperate shrill pitch. "We need to take a collective breath. We are all projecting a lot of negative energy right now. I know emotions are running high, but we are all processing trauma in real time. We need to hold space for understanding. Preston made some unconventional choices, yes, but we are a family. We can heal from this if we just sit down and communicate authentically." The sheer absurdity of her therapy speak hung in the air for a fraction of a second. She was actually trying to gaslight a room full of furious billionaires into believing that federal bank fraud was just a minor emotional conflict that could be resolved with a sharing circle. The reaction was instant and explosive. The real estate developer grabbed a heavy crystal water glass from the center of the table and hurled it violently across the room. It smashed against the mahogany-paneled wall, right next to Beatrice's head, showering the plush carpet in sparkling water and jagged shards of glass. Beatrice let out a terrified scream, covering her head with her hands and shrinking back against the podium. The sharp sound of the shattering crystal finally snapped Preston out of his paralyzed state of shock. He looked at the broken glass, then looked at the furious investors pulling out their phones to call their lawyers and the authorities. The reality of federal prison crashed down on him with crushing weight. He was not just facing a lawsuit, he was facing handcuffs. His eyes darted wildly around the crowded room, settling on the heavy oak doors at the very back. His expression shifted from fear to a completely unhinged feral panic. He grabbed Beatrice by the arm, his grip so tight she winced in pain. "We have to leave," he hissed through clenched teeth, his eyes wide and completely manic. "We have to get out of here right now." He did not wait for her to respond to his frantic and terrifying commands. He physically dragged his mother away from the podium and pulled her stumbling toward the exit, pushing past the angry crowd as he fled the catastrophic ruins of his own making. Preston dragged his mother through the country club lobby, ignoring the outraged shouts echoing behind them. They burst through the glass doors into the bright morning sunlight. The valet barely had time to hand over the keys before Preston snatched them, shoved Beatrice into the passenger seat of his luxury sedan, and peeled out of the circular driveway. The tires squealed violently against the pavement. He drove like an absolute madman, running 2 red lights as he headed straight for the quiet outskirts of the city. Beatrice sat completely frozen in the passenger seat, her hands trembling uncontrollably in her lap. "Where are we going?" she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring engine. "We cannot just run away from the investors. They will call the authorities." Preston gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "Let them call the police," Preston spat, his eyes darting frantically between the open road and the rearview mirror. "They cannot prove federal wire fraud without the original physical documents. Diana only had copies of a few ledgers she somehow stole from me. I still have 10 years of original bank statements, tax returns, and fake commercial invoices sitting in the basement of the old family estate. If the federal agents raid my corporate office today, they will find nothing but perfectly clean digital files. But if they raid the estate, I am completely dead. We have to burn it all down right now before anyone figures out where the records are kept. The old family estate sat at the end of a long, overgrown gravel driveway. It was a massive Victorian home our father had purchased decades ago, now mostly used for storing forgotten antique furniture and decades of hotel archives. Preston slammed on the brakes, parking the car behind a row of thick pine trees to hide it from the main road. He killed the engine and leaped out, practically dragging Beatrice toward the heavy side door. He fumbled with his heavy keychain, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the metal keys twice onto the wooden porch before finally unlocking the deadbolt. The empty house smelled like dust and stale air. They bypassed the grand staircase and headed straight for the narrow wooden door tucked beneath it. The basement was dark, damp, and freezing cold. Preston flicked on the single overhead bulb, casting a harsh yellow light across rows of tall metal filing cabinets and dozens of stacked cardboard boxes. This was the hidden graveyard of our family business. Preston did not hesitate for a single second. He ran directly to a heavy storage shelf in the far corner and grabbed two large metal cans of industrial lighter fluid, the exact kind our father used to keep for the massive outdoor fire pits during the winter holidays. He roughly shoved one cold metal can into Beatrice's hands. "Help me!" he ordered, his voice raw and desperate, echoing off the concrete walls. "Open the cabinet drawers, pour this chemical over everything. We have to make absolutely sure not a single piece of paper survives this afternoon." Beatrice looked down at the heavy metal can resting in her manicured hands. The harsh reality of committing felony arson was actively clashing with her carefully constructed high society persona. She simply could not admit she was helping her son destroy criminal evidence. Her mind could not process that level of guilt. So, as she always did, she twisted the narrative to protect her fragile ego. She unscrewed the red cap of the lighter fluid, the strong chemical scent immediately hitting her nose. "You are right, Preston," she said softly, her eyes taking on a strange, detached glaze as she stared at the boxes. "This place is filled with so much toxic history. Your father hoarded these awful documents, holding on to the past instead of looking toward the future. We are not destroying evidence. We are conducting a deep spiritual purge. We are cleansing the negative energy from our family bloodline. Fire is deeply transformative. It will help us heal from Diana's aggressive betrayal and purify our space." Preston ignored her completely unhinged therapy speak. He was already ripping open the heavy metal drawers of the filing cabinets, pulling folders out onto the floor. He began splashing the clear, foul-smelling chemical indiscriminately over decades of financial records, tax returns, and forged bank statements. Beatrice joined him, her emerald silk dress brushing against the filthy concrete floor as she gracefully poured the lighter fluid over the cardboard boxes. The toxic fumes quickly filled the enclosed basement, stinging their eyes and burning their throats. They were soaked in desperation and absolute delusion. Preston tossed the empty can aside, the metal clattering. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver lighter. Preston flicked the silver lighter. A small yellow flame sparked to life in the dim, damp basement. He did not hesitate. He tossed the lighter directly onto the pile of soaked cardboard boxes. The chemical reaction was instantaneous. A loud whoosh of displaced air echoed through the room as the lighter fluid ignited. Bright orange flames erupted toward the low ceiling, instantly consuming the thick stacks of paper. The heat hit them like a physical wall. Preston stumbled backward, shielding his face with his arm. The fire spread rapidly across the concrete floor, following the liquid trail Beatrice had poured just moments before. Thick black toxic smoke immediately began to billow outward, filling the confined space with choking soot. The wooden shelving units caught fire, the dry timber crackling loudly as it burned. But as the flames devoured an old rotted rug near the back corner of the room, something metallic caught the harsh light of the fire. The rug burned away completely, revealing a heavy steel floor safe embedded directly into the concrete foundation. It was his hidden vault. Beatrice saw the glint of the metal through the thick smoke. Her eyes widened completely, ignoring the intense heat radiating just feet away from her. In her panicked, greedy mind, she instantly assumed her late husband had stashed emergency wealth down there. She thought there must be gold bars, antique jewelry, or stacks of untraceable cash that could save her from her impending financial ruin. She dropped to her hands and knees on the filthy floor, crawling toward the heavy steel door. Preston coughed violently, the smoke burning his lungs. "Mother, we have to go," he screamed over the roaring flames, grabbing the back of her silk dress. "The ceiling is going to catch." Beatrice violently slapped his hand away. "No!" she shrieked, her voice frantic and breathless. "Your father hid something here. He always kept a reserve. This is our way out, Preston. Help me open it." She began pulling desperately at the heavy brass dial, her manicured nails scraping uselessly against the cold steel. She was entirely consumed by her own delusion, convinced that a magical pile of money was going to erase her crimes. The fire crept closer to her expensive dress, but she refused to move, coughing uncontrollably as she clawed at the locked vault. A quarter of a mile down the road, I sat comfortably in the driver's seat of my car, safely hidden behind a row of ancient oak trees. The engine purred quietly. Kendra had called me the moment Preston peeled out of the country club parking lot. She warned me that he was in a state of absolute unhinged panic and was heading straight for the old family estate to destroy the physical evidence. I had driven over immediately, not to stop him, but to watch him dig his own grave. Through the windshield, I saw the first tendrils of thick black smoke rising from the basement vents of the massive Victorian house. The smoke twisted into the clear blue sky, a dark stain against the morning sunlight. I felt absolutely no panic. Let them burn the paper, I thought calmly. Preston was a fool. He actually believed that destroying physical ledgers would erase his digital footprint. He did not understand that the banks, the shell companies, and the wire transfers left a permanent, indestructible electronic trail. By setting this fire, he was not destroying evidence. He was simply adding federal arson and destruction of corporate records to his rapidly growing list of severe felony charges. I watched the smoke thicken, indicating the fire had spread beyond the basement and was beginning to consume the wooden framework of the first floor. I reached into my cup holder and picked up my cell phone. I bypassed my contacts and dialed 911. The operator answered on the second ring, asking for the nature of my emergency. I kept my voice perfectly level and professional, conveying zero emotional distress. "Yes, I am reporting a structure fire at the old family estate on Willow Creek Road," I stated clearly. "I can see heavy black smoke originating from the basement level. Please send the fire department immediately. I believe there are 2 individuals trapped inside the property, and they may be attempting to destroy commercial financial records." I gave the operator the exact address and hung up the phone. I leaned back against the leather seat, watching the dark smoke billow higher into the sky. Preston and Beatrice thought they were taking control of the narrative by destroying the past. They had no idea they were walking directly into the final phase of my trap. I sat alone in the quiet comfort of my car and waited patiently for the loud fire sirens to arrive. I did not have to wait long. Within 7 minutes, the wailing sirens of the local fire department echoed down the quiet suburban road. 2 massive red fire engines and a paramedic ambulance roared past my hidden car, turning sharply onto the gravel driveway of the old family estate. I rolled my window down just slightly, listening to the heavy boots of the firefighters hitting the pavement and the urgent shouts of the incident commander. Through the trees, I watched as the heavy front doors of the estate burst open. Preston and Beatrice stumbled out onto the front lawn, violently coughing and gasping for fresh air. Their faces were smeared with black soot. Beatrice's emerald silk dress was completely ruined, stained with ash and reeking of industrial lighter fluid. Preston looked even worse. His expensive suit jacket was gone, and the white dress shirt he wore underneath was scorched along the left sleeve. The paramedics rushed toward them immediately, wrapping thick thermal blankets around their shoulders and checking their vitals. Preston waved the medics away, his eyes wild and bloodshot as he pointed frantically back toward the burning house. The firefighters had already pulled the heavy hoses from the trucks and were blasting hundreds of gallons of water into the basement windows, trying to suppress the raging flames before they compromised the structural integrity of the entire Victorian home. I grabbed a pair of binoculars from my glove compartment and focused the lenses on the front lawn. I could see the local fire chief, a tall man in a bright yellow turnout coat, approaching Preston with a serious expression. He held a small digital notepad in his hand, clearly asking for a statement about how the fire had started. I watched as Preston's survival instincts kicked into overdrive. Even covered in soot and facing the complete destruction of his childhood home, he defaulted to his primary defense mechanism. He lied. He gestured wildly with his hands, his face contorted in a mask of absolute victimhood. He pointed toward the road, then back to the house, shaking his head aggressively. Beatrice nodded along with him, pulling the thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders and dabbing her soot-stained cheeks as if she were crying. I did not need to be standing next to them to know exactly what they were saying. Preston was telling the fire chief that they had arrived at the house only to find the basement already engulfed in flames. He was likely claiming that he had seen a suspicious car speeding away just moments before. And I knew with absolute certainty whose name they were giving to the authorities. They were blaming me. They were telling the chief that I, the vindictive, mentally unstable sister who had just been publicly humiliated at the country club, had followed them to the estate and set the fire out of pure spite to destroy the family legacy. It was a predictable, pathetic move. They thought that by accusing me of arson they could create a massive distraction and discredit any financial evidence I brought forward. If I was a suspected arsonist, my credibility as a forensic accountant would be instantly called into question. Any judge or jury would look at my red folders and assume they were the fabricated ravings of a scorned woman out for revenge. It was exactly the kind of manipulative gaslighting tactic Beatrice had taught him to use since childhood. But as I watched them play the victims on the manicured lawn, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I lowered the binoculars and tossed them onto the passenger seat. Let them blame me, I thought. Let them tell the police, the fire investigators, and the local news stations that I am a dangerous criminal. Let them burn every single piece of paper in that basement. They were so blinded by their own archaic understanding of business that they believed physical destruction equaled legal immunity. As a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud, I knew a truth that Preston had entirely failed to grasp. Paper is completely useless. It is fragile, easily destroyed, and highly susceptible to forgery. That is why I never relied on it. When Kendra handed me those physical ledgers, I did not just read them. I spent the entire night digitizing every single page, cross-referencing the handwritten notes with the immutable, highly encrypted digital records held by the federal banking system. The original books were currently turning to ash in the basement, but the data they contained was already securely uploaded to 3 different cloud servers, heavily encrypted and legally certified by my attorney. Preston had not destroyed the evidence. He had simply added the federal crime of arson and the deliberate destruction of corporate records to his rapidly expanding list of felony charges. I put my car into drive, carefully backing out of my hidden spot behind the oak trees. I did not need to watch the rest of the show. The trap was fully set, the bait had been taken, and Preston had just locked the cage from the inside. I drove back toward the city, ready for the final act of this disastrous play. I woke up early, poured a hot cup of black coffee, and turned on the local news channel. I knew my family would not waste any time trying to spin the narrative. Sure enough, right after the morning weather report, the screen cut to a live feed standing in front of the charred, blackened remains of our old family estate. Standing behind the yellow caution tape surrounded by eager reporters holding microphones was my mother. Beatrice had somehow managed to find a perfectly tailored somber black dress for the occasion. Her face was strategically pale, completely scrubbed of her usual heavy makeup to emphasize her supposed trauma. She held a crumpled tissue in her hand, dabbing at her dry eyes as the camera zoomed in. Beside her stood Preston. He wore a sharp gray suit, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that he had nearly burned his own mother alive the day before. He looked incredibly, undeniably smug. He had the arrogant posture of a man who firmly believed he had just successfully outsmarted the entire legal system by tossing a lighter onto a pile of cardboard. "It is a devastating tragedy for our family," Beatrice told the lead reporter, her voice shaking with perfectly rehearsed emotion. "We lost decades of cherished memories yesterday. But what hurts the most is knowing who caused this destruction. My daughter Diana has been struggling with severe mental instability and profound emotional toxicity for years. We tried to create a safe space for her to heal, but yesterday, her jealousy over her brother's success finally reached a dangerous breaking point. We believe she followed us to the estate and set the fire in a desperate, vindictive attempt to destroy our family legacy. We are completely heartbroken, but we are fully cooperating with law enforcement to ensure she gets the psychiatric help she so clearly needs." Preston nodded solemnly beside her, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. He leaned toward the microphones, adding his own layer of absolute fiction to the broadcast. "We are just grateful we escaped with our lives," he said, looking directly into the camera lens. "My sister has lost her grip on reality. We hope the authorities handle this swiftly before she hurts anyone else." He was practically glowing with triumph. In his mind, the physical ledgers were gone, his financial crimes were erased, and his brilliant sister was about to be locked away in a psychiatric ward or a state prison. He genuinely thought he had won. I turned off the television, slowly finishing my coffee in the quiet calm of my kitchen. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly focused. Exactly 20 minutes later, a firm knock echoed from my front door. I opened it to find two plainclothes detectives standing on my porch. They were not the corrupt golf-playing sheriff from the day before. These were serious, seasoned investigators from the arson division. Miss Diana, the older detective, began holding up his gold badge. "We need you to come down to the precinct with us for formal questioning regarding the structure fire at your family estate yesterday afternoon. Your mother and brother have provided sworn statements explicitly naming you as the primary suspect." I did not argue. I did not act surprised or defensive. I simply nodded, asked for a moment to grab my coat, and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. I knew this was coming. It was the necessary next step in the sequence. I locked my front door and followed them to their unmarked sedan. The drive to the police station was quiet. They placed me in the back seat, treating me with the cautious distance reserved for suspected felons. When we arrived at the downtown precinct, the bustling energy of the station buzzed around me. As the detectives escorted me through the main lobby toward the holding area, I spotted Preston. He was standing near the front desk, holding a cup of terrible waiting room coffee, talking to a uniformed officer. When he saw me walking past with the detectives, a slow, incredibly arrogant smile spread across his face. He actually raised his coffee cup in a mocking little toast. He was savoring the moment, believing he was watching the complete destruction of my life. He was absolutely certain that the ashes in the basement were the end of the story. I did not look away from him. I held his gaze, my expression completely blank, until the detectives led me down a narrow hallway and into a small, windowless interrogation room. The heavy metal door securely shut behind me with a loud final click. I slowly sat down at the cold steel table, placed my leather briefcase carefully in front of me, and waited for the real conversation to begin. The older detective sat across from me at the cold metal table. He opened a manila folder, spreading out several photographs of the burned estate. The smell of stale coffee and ozone filled the small room. He looked at me with a practiced, heavy stare. "Your mother and brother painted a very clear picture of you this morning, Diana." He began, his voice rough and authoritative. "They told us you have a history of severe mental instability. They said you were recently humiliated at a public event and that you lashed out by setting fire to the family archives. Arson is a first-degree felony. If anyone had been seriously hurt, you would be looking at attempted murder. We know you were angry. Just tell us the truth and we can work with the district attorney to get you the psychiatric help you need." The younger detective leaned against the closed metal door, playing the silent intimidator. I let the older detective finish his entire speech. I did not interrupt, and I did not show a single ounce of fear. When the room finally fell completely silent, I folded my hands on the table and looked directly into his eyes. "Detective?" I asked calmly. "Did my brother happen to tell you exactly what was stored inside that basement?" The older detective frowned clearly, not expecting me to take control of the interrogation. He said it was a storage area for old family memorabilia and outdated hotel tax records. He replied cautiously. I nodded slowly. "Outdated tax records," I repeated. "That is a very convenient way to describe physical evidence of federal bank fraud." I reached down and unlocked the brass clasps of my leather briefcase. Both detectives tensed slightly, but I moved slowly and deliberately. I pulled out my silver laptop and placed it flat on the steel table. "I am a forensic accountant, gentlemen," I explained, opening the screen and typing in my decryption password. "My job is to track missing money across complex corporate structures. Yesterday afternoon, I acquired the original physical ledgers belonging to my brother. I spent 12 hours digitizing every single page. He realized I had them, panicked, and decided to burn down the entire family estate to destroy the paper trail. He thought he was erasing his crimes. He had absolutely no idea that I had already uploaded the entire archive to a secure, heavily encrypted cloud server." I turned the laptop around so the screen faced the two detectives. I tapped the trackpad, opening the master file. The older detective leaned forward, his skepticism momentarily replaced by genuine professional curiosity. "What exactly are we looking at?" he asked, squinting at the dense spreadsheets and scanned documents. "You are looking at a localized Ponzi scheme," I answered smoothly. "You are looking at $18 million in fraudulent commercial loans. You are looking at the exact wire transfers Preston used to wash stolen investor capital through Delaware shell companies to buy a luxury mansion in Miami. And right here, I pointed to a high-resolution scan of a signed contract. You are looking at the forged signatures he used to secure those loans." The younger detective pushed off the metal door and walked over to the table to get a closer look. He stared at the screen, his eyes widening as he read the undeniable proof of massive corporate theft. I scrolled down to the next folder, revealing the exact timestamps of the digital uploads. "I completed this backup at 3 in the morning, I stated firmly. "The fire at the estate started at 10. Why would I spend all night meticulously preserving criminal evidence only to commit arson hours later to destroy the original copies? I would not. Preston set that fire. He burned his own childhood home because he was cornered, desperate and fundamentally stupid." The detective sat back. The entire dynamic of the room had shifted completely. He looked from the glowing laptop screen to my perfectly calm face. He realized I was not a mentally unstable arsonist. I was a highly trained financial investigator who had just handed the police department the biggest corporate fraud case of their entire careers. The story my mother and brother spun on the morning news was unraveling before their eyes. The detective slowly pulled his small black notebook closed and placed it on the table. He looked up at his younger partner, exchanging a very heavy and meaningful glance, then turned his attention back to me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the steel, and let out a long, heavy breath. "Miss Diana," he said quietly, his tone now completely respectful and deadly serious. "I think we need to step outside and make a few urgent phone calls to the federal authorities right now." The heavy metal door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the small interrogation room. I did not close my laptop. I simply sat back in my hard plastic chair, listening to the muffled sounds of the busy precinct echoing through the thick walls. The older detective had left in a massive hurry, completely abandoning his aggressive interrogation tactics. I knew exactly what was happening out in the bustling hallway. They were frantically scrambling. A routine arson investigation had just exploded into an $18 million corporate fraud scandal involving interstate banking systems and forged commercial loans. Local police departments are not equipped to handle sophisticated financial crimes of this massive magnitude. They needed to consult their superiors before taking another step. 15 minutes passed in total silence. I stared at the glowing screen of my laptop, the digital ledgers reflecting the absolute financial ruin of my brother. Finally, the brass door handle turned. The older detective stepped back into the room, but this time he was not alone. He held the door open for a tall man wearing a crisp white shirt with shiny gold insignia pinned to the collar. It was the precinct chief. His face was stern, his jaw set tightly as he entered the confined space. He did not introduce himself or offer a handshake. He walked straight to the cold steel table, pulled up the empty chair, and sat down directly across from me. "Show me what you found," the chief demanded, his rough voice low and devoid of any pleasantries. His sharp eyes were locked onto my glowing laptop screen. I leaned forward and angled the screen toward him. I guided him meticulously through the exact digital trail I had just shown his detectives minutes prior. I did not rush the presentation. I explained the complex mechanics of the high-interest bridge loans, the 3 Delaware shell companies, and the Miami luxury real estate purchase. I highlighted the specific dates and the staggering amounts of the wire transfers. But then I showed him something crucial I had strategically held back during the initial questioning. I opened a new encrypted folder containing the heavily guarded origin documents of the shadow lender located in Vegas. Look closely at the international routing numbers Preston used to receive the initial $18 million bridge loan, I instructed smoothly. The money did not come from a standard private equity firm or a legitimate commercial bank. It was quietly routed through a series of offshore holding accounts before finally landing in the Vegas company. My brother was so desperate for rapid cash that he did not do any basic due diligence on his lenders. He blindly borrowed $18 million from a front company known in federal law enforcement circles to be directly associated with an international criminal syndicate. The precinct chief stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. He leaned closer to the screen, his dark eyes rapidly scanning the routing numbers and the corporate registry documents I had pulled from federal databases. The color began to drain rapidly from his weathered face. His tanned complexion turned to a sickly shade of pale gray. The terrifying realization of what he was actually looking at hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He was no longer looking at a spoiled rich kid stealing from a wealthy family trust. He was looking at a massive money laundering operation and federal bank fraud tied directly to organized crime. Preston thought he was outsmarting everyone. I continued, my voice steady and cold in the quiet room. He took their dirty money to pay off his angry local investors and fund his lavish lifestyle, using our family hotel as the primary collateral. When he inevitably defaulted on the payments, the syndicate was preparing to seize the commercial property. I intervened and foreclosed on the asset, first locking the hotel and the remaining funds permanently inside an irrevocable federal trust. I trapped their illegal money, and I effectively trapped my brother. The older detective stood still by the door, his eyes wide with absolute shock. The local police had almost arrested me for arson based entirely on the panicked lies of a desperate man who was actively laundering dirty money. If they had locked me up and frozen my personal assets, they would have inadvertently handed $18 million of clean corporate real estate directly over to a dangerous criminal enterprise. The chief swallowed hard. His thick hands trembled slightly as he reached out and touched the edge of the steel table. He pushes the laptop away and says, "We can't charge you with arson. In fact, we can't touch this case at all anymore. This isn't local fraud. You need to stay right here. The federal agents are on their way." The transition of power was remarkably swift. While I remained comfortably seated in the quiet precinct securely outside the blast radius, the massive federal machine finally roared to life. Across town, my brother and mother were completely oblivious to the impending disaster. After putting on their tearful performance for the morning news cruise, Preston and Beatrice had retreated to the very place where their financial crimes began. They returned to the family hotel. They genuinely believed they had weathered the storm. In their arrogant, deeply flawed logic, the ashes in the estate basement had erased the past, and their televised lies had successfully framed me for the destruction. Preston had ordered the hotel staff to clear the private executive lounge on the top floor. He and Beatrice sat on plush velvet sofas sipping expensive champagne poured from crystal flutes. They were actively celebrating their supposed victory. Preston was likely already planning how he would manipulate the local judge to dissolve my trust once I was safely locked away in a state psychiatric facility. Beatrice was probably relieved that she would not have to downsize her lifestyle or face the humiliation of losing her country club membership. They felt completely untouchable, elevated high above the city in their luxury glass tower. Their celebration was abruptly shattered exactly at noon. The heavy glass doors of the Grand Hotel lobby did not just open, they were violently pushed aside. Dozens of black SUVs with tinted windows had silently surrounded the entire perimeter of the building, blocking every entrance exit and loading dock. Over 30 heavily armed federal agents, wearing dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI, swarmed into the elegant space. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, immediately taking control of the front desk, securing the elevators, and locking down the administrative offices. The sophisticated jazz music playing over the lobby speakers was abruptly cut off, replaced by the sharp, authoritative commands of federal law enforcement. Guests gasped and backed away, some pulling out their phones to record the chaotic scene. The hotel manager, completely panicked, tried to intervene, but an agent quickly flashed a badge and a federal search warrant, ordering him to stand down immediately. The lead agent, a tall, imposing woman with a deeply serious expression, did not waste time in the lobby. She signaled a tactical team and they moved swiftly toward the private executive elevators. Up on the top floor, Preston and Beatrice were completely unaware of the massive raid unfolding beneath them until the heavy mahogany doors of the executive lounge burst open. The lead agent marched into the room, flanked by 4 armed operatives. Preston dropped his crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, the expensive liquid soaking into the expensive rug. He scrambled backward over the velvet sofa, his face completely devoid of color, his heart hammering against his ribs. The smug arrogance he had displayed at the police station hours earlier evaporated instantly. Beatrice, however, reacted with her usual astonishing level of delusion. When she saw the federal agents, she did not immediately comprehend the danger. She saw law enforcement and instantly assumed they were there to validate the lies she had told on television. She believed her manufactured narrative had worked so perfectly that the federal government had stepped in to help her. She stood up quickly, smoothing her ruined silk dress, and pointed a trembling, dramatic finger toward the ceiling. "Yes," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls of the lounge. "Finally, you are here to arrest my daughter. She committed federal wire fraud. She illegally transferred $18 million out of our commercial accounts last night, and then she tried to burn us alive this morning. You have to arrest Diana immediately. She stole everything from us." The lead FBI agent did not even look at Beatrice. She completely ignored the frantic, gaslighting mother. The agent's cold, hard eyes were locked entirely on Preston, who was now trembling uncontrollably behind the sofa, realizing exactly why they were really there. The agent pulled a thick official document from her jacket pocket, unfolded it, and held it up. "Preston Vance," the agent announced, her voice booming through the silent lounge. "We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant for this entire property. Furthermore, I have a federal arrest warrant for you. You are being taken into federal custody immediately for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, commercial bank fraud, and the intentional laundering of illicit funds connected to an international criminal syndicate." Beatrice froze. Her hand dropped slowly to her side. The triumphant smile she had been wearing vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute paralyzing horror. The agents moved in rapidly, grabbing Preston by the arms and forcing him face down onto the luxury rug he had just ruined with his champagne. The heavy thud of my brother hitting the floor echoed through the lounge. Preston gasped for air as the agents pinned his arms behind his back, the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs snapping securely around his wrists. He struggled wildly against the expensive rug, his gray suit twisting around his shoulders. "Wait!" he yelled, his voice muffled by the thick carpet. "You cannot do this. This is a misunderstanding. I am the chief executive officer of this hotel. I have lawyers. This is a civil dispute with my sister, not a federal matter." The lead agent did not even blink at his desperate protests. She stepped over the puddle of spilled champagne, the thick rubber soles of her tactical boots leaving wet prints on the hardwood floor. She looked down at him with an expression of pure clinical disgust. "You do not need corporate lawyers," she stated coldly. "You need a federal public defender." Beatrice stood completely paralyzed against the velvet sofa. Her mind simply could not process the violence of reality invading her pristine, carefully curated world. She looked from the armed agents to her golden child squirming on the floor. "Excuse me," she stammered, her voice weak and trembling. "There must be some kind of administrative error here. My son is a legitimate businessman. He just made a few creative accounting decisions." The lead agent finally turned her cold gaze toward my mother. "Do not speak another word, unless you want to be placed in handcuffs as a co-conspirator," she ordered, her tone slicing through the room like a razor. Beatrice snapped her mouth shut, her face draining of whatever color she had left. She shrank back against the glass wall, finally realizing that no amount of therapy speak or social manipulation was going to save them from the federal government. The agent turned her attention back to Preston, who had stopped struggling and was now staring up at her with wide, terrified eyes. "You think you are incredibly smart, do you not?" the agent asked, crouching down so she was at eye level with his sweating face. "You thought you could just borrow money from a shadow-holding company in Vegas to cover your massive corporate losses, and nobody would notice the discrepancies." Preston swallowed hard, sweat dripping into his eyes. It was a bridge loan, he choked out, desperately clinging to his fabricated business narrative. It was high interest, but it was perfectly legal capital. "I signed a contract. I was going to pay it back as soon as the market stabilized. I did not steal anything." The agent let out a dry, humorless laugh that sent chills down his spine. "Legal capital," she repeated mockingly. She reached into her dark windbreaker and pulled out a thick printed file, dropping it directly onto the floor in front of his face. "Let me educate you on who you actually signed that contract with last year. The holding company in Vegas is not a bank. It is not a private equity firm. It is a highly sophisticated front operation, entirely controlled by an international drug cartel." Preston stopped breathing. His eyes darted to the file, reading the classified federal insignia stamped across the top. The agent leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a lethal whisper. "For the past 6 months, we have been tracking the flow of illicit narcotics revenue across state lines. We followed the money straight from the border into the Vegas holding company. And then we watched in absolute amazement as a desperate, arrogant hotel heir willingly took $18 million of that dirty cartel money and deposited it directly into his legitimate commercial operating accounts. You were not just keeping your failing business afloat. You were actively laundering millions of dollars for organized crime. You integrated their dirty cash into your payroll, your vendor payments, and your fake investor dividends. You washed it completely clean for them." Preston let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. The terrifying weight of her words crushed whatever remained of his massive ego. He had not just committed corporate fraud against his own family and his wealthy country club investors. He had inadvertently climbed into bed with ruthless criminals who would gladly kill him without a second thought if he lost their money. And he had lost their money. He had lost every single dime of it when I seized the accounts last night. "Where is the $18 million?" the agent demanded, standing back up and towering over him. "The cartel is looking for their money, and so are we. Where did you hide the funds?" Preston squeezed his eyes shut, tears of pure terror leaking out. He sobbed uncontrollably right there on the floor. "I do not have it," he wailed. "My own sister took it." Beatrice heard Preston say my name, and her twisted survival instinct snapped back into focus. She seized upon his desperate confession like a drowning woman grabbing a life preserver. Her paralyzing fear vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden surge of vindictive energy. She stepped away from the glass wall, pointing a shaking finger directly at the lead federal agent. "Did you hear him?" Beatrice demanded, her shrill voice echoing loudly in the tense lounge. He just told you exactly where the missing money went. My completely unhinged daughter stole it. Diana hacked into our secure commercial accounts last night and drained $18 million into her private trust fund. She is the one you actually need to be pinning to the floor. She is the criminal mastermind who ruined this family. If there is dirty cartel money involved, she is the one actively hoarding it. Arrest her right now, put her in handcuffs, and let my son go. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive lounge swung open before the lead agent could respond to my mother's demands. I walked calmly into the center of the room. I was flanked by 2 additional federal agents, their imposing presence confirming my protected status. I wore the exact same sharp charcoal business suit I had worn to confront the corrupt sheriff earlier. I held my leather briefcase in one hand, standing in absolute contrast to my brother squirming on the ruined rug and my mother unraveling in her ash-stained dress. I had taken the private elevator up from the hotel lobby after leaving the local police precinct, escorted directly by the specialized federal team I had been communicating with. Beatrice gasped loudly when she saw me standing there. "You!" she shrieked, taking a furious step toward me before a federal agent firmly forced her to stay back. "You vindictive little thief! Tell them you stole the money so Preston can be cleared of these ridiculous criminal charges." I looked down at my brother. He was staring up at me, his face stained with tears and sweat, completely broken and terrified. I did not steal a single dime. "Preston?" I said, my voice perfectly level across the silent room. "You really thought I would commingle illicit cartel funds with our legitimate family trust? I am a professional forensic accountant. I saw the massive red flags in your shadow lender contracts 3 days ago. Tracing the routing numbers back to an international syndicate, I knew I could not handle this privately. I did not go to the incompetent local police. I went straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I walked closer to the velvet sofa, looking directly into my mother's disbelieving eyes. "For the past 72 hours, I have been working covertly as a federal informant," I explained smoothly. "The foreclosure I executed last night during your gala was not a hostile corporate takeover. It was a highly coordinated federal sting operation. When I pressed enter on my laptop in the hotel parking lot, that $18 million did not go into my personal bank account. It bypassed my own private trust entirely. I routed the funds directly into a secure government escrow account. The money is currently sitting safely in federal custody, held as prime material evidence against your son and the criminal organization he got into bed with. I trapped the cartel funds so they could not be quietly withdrawn when the authorities inevitably closed in." Preston let his head drop heavily against the hardwood floor. A fresh wave of pathetic sobs racked his shoulders. He finally understood the absolute perfection of the trap. Beatrice shook her head frantically, refusing to accept the brutal reality unfolding in front of her. "That is impossible," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You had no right to do that. You are definitely going to federal prison too. You were part of this business." I simply smiled, showing a cold expression of absolute victory. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a certified legal document bearing the official seal of the Department of Justice. "I am fully protected under a comprehensive federal immunity agreement," I stated clearly. "I am their star cooperating witness." I handed over the digital ledgers, secured the illicit funds, and delivered the exact location of the original physical documents right before you tried to burn them. I am walking out of this building a free woman. The lead agent grabbed Preston by his expensive collar and hauled him roughly to his feet. His hands were securely locked behind his back. The arrogance, the privilege, and the massive financial empire were completely gone. He was nothing but a federal prisoner now. "Let us go," the agent commanded, roughly pushing him toward the heavy mahogany doors to face the media outside. Before the agents could force Preston out of the room, the heavy mahogany doors swung open one last time. Kendra stepped into the doorway, completely blocking his exit. She looked absolutely flawless in a sharp white suit, a stark contrast to my older brother and his soot-stained appearance. Preston looked at her, a pathetic glimmer of hope flashing in his eyes. He thought his brilliant wife was there to defend him. Instead, Kendra calmly reached into her designer bag and pulled out two crisp legal documents. She slapped the first document directly against his chest. "Those are the divorce papers," she stated, her voice as cold as ice. "I am taking the house, the cars, and full control of my design firm." Then she held up the second document, making sure he saw the Federal Department of Justice seal printed at the top. "And this is my full immunity agreement. Diana negotiated it for me in exchange for the physical ledgers you hid in the basement. You are going to prison, Preston. And I am going to be entirely fine." Preston let out a choked, devastated sob as the federal agents shoved him past his soon-to-be former wife, marching him down the hallway and into the flashing cameras of the local news reporters waiting in the lobby below. The lounge was suddenly very quiet. Kendra gave me a respectful nod, turned on her heel, and walked away to start her new life. Only Beatrice, the federal lead agent, and I remained. My mother stood shivering in the center of the room. Her emerald silk dress was ruined, her social standing was annihilated, and her golden child was in federal custody. The reality of her total bankruptcy finally crashed down upon her. She looked at the federal agent, then looked at me. The arrogant socialite vanished, replaced by a desperate, terrified older woman. She stumbled forward, reaching her hands out toward me. "Diana," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face, stripping away all her fake therapy speak. "You have to help me. They are going to take my home. They are going to freeze my credit cards. I have nothing left. You are my daughter. You have all that trust money now. Please, Diana, we are family." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, worthless, and crazy. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I looked past her to the two large hotel security guards who had followed the federal agents upstairs and were standing near the doorway. "Security," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "Remove her." The guards stepped forward immediately, grabbing Beatrice by the arms. She shrieked and fought them, kicking her heels against the floor as they dragged her out of the executive lounge, echoing the exact same humiliation she had inflicted upon me just 3 days prior. 6 months later, the dust finally settled. Preston pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges to avoid a lengthy trial and was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Beatrice was completely evicted from her country club lifestyle. Stripped of her stolen wealth, she was forced to move into a tiny rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her wealthy friends entirely abandoned her, refusing to associate with the mother of a convicted cartel money launderer. The government officially seized the hotel property to liquidate the criminal assets. When the massive building went up for public auction, I was sitting in the front row. Using the clean, legitimate funds from the irrevocable trust my father had secretly left me, I placed the winning bid. I bought the hotel back entirely free and clear of any debt, shadow lenders, or toxic family drama. I legally owned the entire empire. I immediately ordered a complete renovation and rebranded the property, stripping away the old family name and erecting a bright new sign above the front doors. I kept my forensic accounting firm running my new empire with precision, honesty, and absolute control. Looking back at the night I was kicked out of the gala, I realized my mother did me a massive favor. She pushed me out of a burning building right before it collapsed. My journey taught me a vital lesson that I want to share with every single woman listening today. You do not need to sit quietly and endure disrespect just because someone shares your bloodline. You do not need to accept the role of the scapegoat, and you certainly do not need to beg anyone for a seat at their table. When you know your own worth, build your independence, and hold your ground, you have the power to buy the entire building. Thank you for watching.